Top military officials released new images Wednesday from the raid that killed the leader of ISIS. These scenes are from the U.S. special operation targeting Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He detonated a suicide vest, killing himself and 3 children. Chip Reed is at the Pentagon.
Video released by the Pentagon shows the initial U.S. strikes on al-Baghdadi's compound. General Kenneth McKenzie, commander of CENTCOM, oversaw the operation and today narrated the dramatic assault.
These individuals, who we don't assess were affiliated with Baghdadi, but nonetheless demonstrated hostile intent against U.S. forces, were killed by 2 airstrikes from supporting helicopters.
That cleared the way for the commandos to approach the compound.
With the assault force surrounding the compound, we repeatedly urged those inside to come out peacefully.
When they didn't, the commandos went in. Al-Baghdadi, chased by this heroic military dog, ran into a dead-end tunnel where he ignited his suicide vest.
He crawled into a hole with 2 small children and blew himself up.
Once U.S. forces had cleared the area, the compound was demolished by multiple strikes.
It looks pretty much like a parking lot with large potholes right now.
President Trump watched the drama unfold on live TV in the White House Situation Room Saturday night.
We had absolutely perfect, as though you were watching a movie.
He described al-Baghdadi as scared out of his mind in his final moments.
Whimpering and crying and screaming all the way.
General McKenzie could not confirm that claim and made clear that ISIS is far from finished.
So we're under no illusions that it's going to go away just because we kill Baghdadi. It will remain. They will be dangerous. We suspect they will try some form of retribution attack.
On Capitol Hill, the acting director of the National Counterterrorism Center predicted that ISIS will have its new leader soon because they have what he called, quote, a deep bench. Elaine?
Chip Reed, thank you. Former Defense Secretary James Mattis left the Trump administration when the president floated his initial plan to withdraw troops from Syria back in December 2018. Despite their differences, Mattis has rarely criticized the president's policy decisions in public in the 10 months since he left the administration. In an interview with The Atlantic earlier this year, Mattis explained why. He said, quote, "If you leave an administration, you owe some silence. When you leave an administration over clear policy differences, you need to give the people who are still there as much opportunity as possible to defend the country." A new book by one of Mattis's former aides is pulling back the curtain of the former defense secretary's disagreements within the West Wing. It's called Holding the Line. The author, Guy Snodgrass, takes us inside the Trump administration's Pentagon when Mattis was in charge. And Guy joins me now from Washington. He's a retired commander in the United States Navy and Mattis's former chief speechwriter and communications director. Thanks very much, Guy, for being with us. Was Mattis's disagreement with the president over Syria the reason why you believe he ultimately left the administration?
Thanks again for having me. It's great to be with you. When you think about America's place in this world, we've had a long-standing leadership role, and we've relied heavily for our own success and the success of our allies on these long-standing alliances and partnerships around the world. And to suddenly order a ad hoc withdrawal from Syria is quite alarming, and that's just one of the reasons why Secretary Mattis chose to leave.
Well, would Mattis react any differently to pulling out troops now that al-Baghdadi is dead?
No, I don't think he would. He would say that when America gives its word, it should keep it, and that's something he testified to Congress about back in 2018 when we were talking about the nuclear agreement with Iran. And, of course, at that point, that was a crisis point, an inflection point for this nation. There's been a series of events where this president has proven that he is very interested in pinning medals on his own chest while he's looking to undermine President Obama's legacy. And some of that means you're walking away from some of these long-standing agreements and alliances. But the danger is that after being partnered up with other nations for decades, to suddenly undo that on a whim is something that does not serve us well in the long term.
Well, I want to talk about some of the details in your book, particularly eye-opening. People will often know that sometimes what you hear officially is not necessarily the entirety of what is happening behind the scenes. What was your sense of the president's foreign policy pronouncements and how it was that Jim Mattis may or may not have been in the loop on those various announcements?
Just like you mentioned, there were a number of times where this administration would catch us at the Pentagon flat-footed. In fact, there's an entire chapter in the book called Summer of Surprises, and it walks you through our alarm as we learned that we had, without any notice, created a Space Force where we had ceased our international exercises, our military exercises with the South Koreans. And then, of course, when President Trump went overseas to Brussels to the NATO ministerial and held it hostage because he wanted more funding. Now, I agree with the president that we need to have our allies and partners pay their fair share to help support our efforts abroad. But to do so without being able to give the Pentagon a heads up, it's like pulling out your pistol and shooting yourself in the foot.
What's the effect when something like that is sort of announced and then, folks in the Pentagon are learning about it, not from the commander-in-chief himself in a private setting, but just out in the public, the way other people are learning about it?
For those of us at the Pentagon, we would learn about it by watching the Twitter feed or maybe a frantic phone call over to the Pentagon. And just like you said, our allies and partners, some of the leaders there are doing the same. These were not coordinated reveals where the White House or the Pentagon had reached out and given them a heads up. So to be in the room as Secretary Mattis would field a frantic phone call from a counterpart in Japan or a counterpart from South Korea who was alarmed not only with the immediate decision, but was questioning, what does this mean for America long term? Were we going to be walking back from other international agreements or alliances? And did this mean we were retreating from the world stage?
Well, you also say in the book that the president attempted to lure Jim Mattis into doing unethical things, in particular with Amazon. What can you tell us about that?
Well, there is a scene in the book where Mattis turns to us in a meeting in his office and relays to us the conversation he's had with President Trump, where President Trump directed him to, quote, screw Amazon. He wanted to block, the president wanted to block Amazon from the ability to compete in the $10 billion cloud computing contract that would transform the way the department handles information. And Secretary Mattis turned to us and said, we're not going to do that. We're going to do it legally and ethically by the book. And that's how I saw Secretary Mattis behave as the Defense Secretary throughout the entire tenure.
And Microsoft won that contract this week, we should know. But the reasoning, as you understood it, is because of Jeff Bezos and his ownership of Amazon. Is that right?
Well, there is a history of bad blood that exists between Jeff Bezos and President Trump, and I think it's largely one way, meaning from President Trump to Jeff Bezos. But there's another scene in the book where I bring you into the room. We're in the room to give the president a top-level briefing about the critical nature of our alliances and partnerships, just how important that is for America. And out of nowhere, that's when he brings up a Washington Post report about some information from inside the White House. And President Trump went on for 10 minutes or more talking about how that reporter should be sued, how the Washington Post should be screwed, how he wanted to get and strike out against Jeff Bezos. And I think you've seen that carry through over the course of several years now.
I want to read a quote that you recalled from the late Senator John McCain, who expressed his frustration with Jim Mattis. McCain said this, quote, "Mr. Secretary, I have an appreciation for you and your leadership team at the Pentagon. However, during your confirmation, you said we'd be in communication with each other, but this is only the third time in 9 months that I've seen you. There's a whole lot going on around the world, but no one is coming over to inform us." Did Jim Mattis's time as Defense Secretary hurt his reputation in Washington?
No, I don't believe it did. I know there's going to be a lot of discussion peeling apart his time as Defense Secretary. The one thing that stood out to me above all else when I watched Secretary Mattis is he had a position of significant responsibility. And of course, America has a global leadership role. So you're not just dealing with America's military, you're dealing with a myriad of issues that are happening around the world. That takes a lot of time. And as you read in that chapter and the passage you just read to your audience, there are a lot of things you have to cover, and certainly briefing Congress and keeping them informed, while very important, is just one of those many things.
Tell us why you eventually left your position there alongside General Mattis.
There was an opportunity to pursue another job in the Pentagon, and unfortunately, as the readers can see in the book, when that didn't work out, I elected to go ahead. I mean, I had retired from military service. I loved my 20 years as a naval officer, as a combat pilot, and I was honored to have the opportunity to serve alongside Secretary Mattis. But certainly when it was the opportunity to step out and find other ways to make a positive impact, I wanted to pursue those. I think as history peers back, they're going to say that Secretary Mattis had a very steady hand on the tiller at the Department of Defense. It can't be lost on any American that when he came into office and when President Trump came into office, that you had the nuclear crisis with North Korea, with intercontinental ballistic missiles being fired off. You had the campaign to defeat ISIS. There were so many things moving off at the same time. And despite those international issues and the internal chaos that was occurring within the administration, all through it all, Secretary Mattis stayed steady, he stayed calm, and he helped guide the department as we look to restore the readiness and lethality for America's military.
Guy, you faced some really strong pushback from the Pentagon in getting your book published. What can you tell us about that?
Well, that's not a joke. Secretary Mattis himself asked me not to write this book. The Pentagon tried to block it for several months, and it was only until we sued the Pentagon that we were able to get the manuscript free. Now, as a former government employee, I can tell you that I know I have an obligation to make sure that I submit the manuscript so it can be reviewed to ensure no classified information was taken out. But this review certainly went far beyond that. So this was a contested book. It was difficult to get out. But I've always believed that your character, your honor, your integrity demands that you do the right thing regardless of the consequences, not just when politics are in your favor.
I do want to ask you to respond to what Secretary Mattis told Politico about your book. He said, quote, "Mr. Snodgrass was a junior staffer who took notes in some meetings but played no role in decision-making. His choice to write a book reveals an absence of character." What's your response to that?
Well, my response real-time to that quote was a lot of people were asking me to respond, and I just simply posted the Defense Superior Service Medal that Secretary Mattis himself had awarded me when I retired from the military. It walks you through all of the elements of national and international significance that I was honored to have a part in.
And finally, Guy, what is it that you want folks to ultimately take away from your book and that inside account that you're providing of what it was really like alongside Secretary Mattis in the Trump administration?
Just how critically important it is that we stay focused during this tumultuous period of time. There's a lot of internal distractors that are pulling us away from what's incredibly important for national security right now. And if I'm China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, I am giddy with excitement to watch the impeachment inquiry, to watch us withdraw forces from Syria, to watch us doing a lot of things that are diminishing America's place on the world stage. I think that's very alarming and something that your viewers should have an opportunity to learn more about.
Do you think the United States is less safe now?
I do. I think that America is not only less safe, but I also worry that our international standing has been eroded, and it's going to take years to rebuild that.
Guy Snodgrass in Washington for us. Guy, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.